talking to you today. I'm going to be talking to you today about communication, specifically the communication policy of the MTR. You can feel free to type questions in the chat, which I will do my best to keep an eye on. You can also message one of the organizers if one of the organizers wants to speak the question or wants the questioner to speak the question. That's okay with me also. So this presentation is divided into 4 parts for 4 specific aspects of the communication policy. All of this is from section 4 of the Magic Tournament rules, and the policies apply at every rules enforcement level with one small exception, which I will get to when we discuss types of information. This also is designed to go in any order. You might call it out of order sequencing, I guess. So if there's any specific requests that any specific aspect of policy that someone would like me to start with, I'm happy to do so. You can, again, type that in the chat if you have a specific request, or communicate through one of the conference organizers. I don't see anybody typing, so which is fine. If you don't have a preference, I'm happy to start anywhere. So let's start then with types of information. And if for some reason you have any trouble hearing me or understanding anything, please also type in the chat. So types of information is covered in section 4.1 of the MTR. This is one of the oldest sections of communication policy. And the MTR divides any information, any communication in the game into 4 types: status information, free information, derived information, and private information. So let's start with status information, which has the most restrictions on it. So the definition of status information is this, what you see on the screen. And this is the entire list. There's nothing else. This is everything that is status information, and that is life totals, any counters attached to a player, such as energy or poison, any continuous effects with no defined expiration within the game that are on a specific player, such as Monarch or City's Blessing, or with the new set, Initiative, and any mana that is in a player's mana pool. And the policy is, for status information, players must proactively announce any changes to their own status information, and they must represent it with something physical. So they can't simply speak it, they have to also use paper or dice or beads or something like that. In fact, at competitive and professional REL, players can't use dice because they need something that is more, that is less easily changed. So paper or a token or something. When I say that players must be proactive, that means every time the status information changes, the policy requires them to announce the change, even if the opponent doesn't ask, doesn't say anything. Of course, players must always represent status information correctly. You're not allowed to lie about your life total, or can't forget to mention that you become the monarch, etc. And if you notice there's any discrepancy, any error in the way your opponent is recording or tracking status information, you must point it out as soon as you notice it. So if you say, I'm at 10 life, and you see your opponent writes down 12 life, you have to point that out. You're not allowed to let the opponent mislead themselves. So some examples of statements about status information. I have the city's blessing, or I have the initiative. I have 5 energy counters, because that energy counters are counters attached to a player, or saying to the opponent, you are at 13 life. These are all statements about status information. They must be correct. And as I said, players are required to proactively announce changes to status information. The next type of information is free information. And the definition of free information is, again, what's on this list. This is the entire list of free information. Details of any current game actions and past game actions still affect the game state. For example, I've played a land this turn, or you have played a land this turn. Those are statements about free information. The name of any visible object, that can be a card, a token, a counter. The number of types of any counters that aren't already mentioned in status information, so any counters on permanents, for example. The state of any object or player, whether something is tapped or untapped, whether it's face up or face down, whether it's front side or back side, what something is attached to. The game score of the current match. So, for example, who's won the first game. Also, the current step or phase, and who the active player is. These are all types of free information. And what policy says about free information is players must answer questions truthfully and completely. It means they must give the entire information that pertains to something. They can't say just part of it. And players must, of course, make true statements about free information. Now, players are not required to proactively announce free information, unlike status information. They can say nothing, but if their opponent asks, they must give a true and complete answer. And some statements or questions about about free information. Which of your lands are untapped? That's asking about the state of the opponent's objects, game objects. So any question must be answered, and the answer must be truthful and complete. Did I play a land this turn? Well, maybe I forgot, but if you were tracking whether I played a land, then you have to answer that question truthfully. You're not allowed to remain silent. This piece of paper is a goblin token. This is what I'm using to represent the goblin token. So that is all examples of free information, and all these statements must be truthful and complete. The next type of information is derived information. And the definition of derived information is the number of any kind of objects in any game zone that's not already defined as free information. So, for example, the number of creatures. All characteristics of objects in public zones that are not already in the free or status information categories, and game rules, policy, and oracle text. So as you can see, we're beginning to move a little further away from the most basic types of information into stuff that's a little more general and a little less specific. Before I get to so some examples of statements or questions about derived information. How many cards do you have is the number of objects in the game zone. What does that card do is essentially asking for oracle text. And the rules for derived information. Players do not have to answer questions about derived information. They can remain silent. Now, you still have to allow the opponent to determine this. So, for example, if your opponent asks you, what does that card do? You're not allowed to put your hand over it and prevent the opponent from seeing it. Players have to represent derived information truthfully, but not necessarily completely. And this is because if someone asks you, what does that card do? that could be a very long answer, and we don't want to penalize players for accidentally omitting some part of the derived information, but the statement still must be true. So for example, if you ask, what does that card do? You can say, well, this is a planeswalker. It has this +1 ability that bounces a card to your hand. Now, that statement doesn't say anything about the planeswalker's other abilities, but it's still a true statement. That's all that is required by communication policy. However, at regular rules enforcement, anything that is in this category of derived information is considered free information. So if you're playing in an FNM or a pre-release, then statements about derived information must be true and complete, because it is actually free information at those that are rules enforcement level. And the final type of information is private information. And the definition for private information is pretty simple. Everything else, anything that's not status information, not free information, and not derived information is private information. So Chris asks, can the player who is asked reply, ask a judge instead? Absolutely. And again, keep in mind that this is for derived information, so this only applies at competitive or professional rules enforcement level. But at that rules enforcement level, the player is never obligated to answer the question. If you do say something about derived information, it must be true, but you're not required to say anything. You can remain silent. You can say, go ask a judge. You can say, I'm not going to answer that question. Any of those responses are perfectly legal. And in fact, if the player is asking about derived information, it's probably a good idea to ask a judge. So for private information, players do not have to answer questions about private information, same as for derived information, and they can even misrepresent private information. Totally legal. You can lie when it comes to private information. A couple of examples. I have a counterspell in my hand. Well, cards in a hidden zone, like the hand, are private information. You can say anything you want. Or asking your opponent, what deck are you playing? That's private information. The opponent doesn't have to answer. If they do answer, they can lie. They can say, I'm playing Jund, when in fact they're playing a control deck. Now, I mentioned that all these aspects of policy apply at any rules enforcement level, keeping in mind that at regular, derived information becomes free information. But there is one aspect of or one consequence of the types of information policy that does only come into effect at competitive and professional rules enforcement level, and this is the infraction communication policy violation. This only exists at competitive and professional rel, doesn't exist at regular rel. So at a FNM or pre-release, there's no such infraction as communication policy violation. This is covered in section 3.7 of the IPG. Now, CPV, as we often call it, is not the same thing as miscommunication. It's not just bad communication. It specifically has two elements. That number one, the player violated the communication policy. So there are lots of types of miscommunication or just bad communication. And this can especially happen when a player is speaking a different language. Players can communicate unclearly, or they can say something that is just a little misleading because maybe they're speaking in a different language. But it's only a CPV if the player violates the communication policy and another player made a decision based on that miscommunication, that illegal miscommunication, that violation of the communication policy. If nobody made a decision based on the communication policy violation, so not the best phrase to use here. If nobody made a decision based on the wrong statement, then there's no CPV. So if you tell your opponent, like, the name of this card is Island, but it's really a forest because you just get mixed up and like the land is in a different language and you don't recognize the illustration and you just get confused about what the card does. If nobody makes a decision based on that wrong communication, there's no CPV. I mean, the judge will still tell you you should communicate better, but there's no infraction. So if there is an infraction, one of the things to keep in mind for CPV is because it is in the category of tournament errors, the second time a player commits an infraction, it's upgraded to a game loss. This is pretty rare. It's rare even for one CPV to happen, let alone two. But if it happens a second time, it's a game loss. Some examples of communication policy violations. Non-active player claims that the active player already activated their planeswalker. And as a result, the active player decides not to activate their planeswalker. So this statement is a statement about past game actions that affect the current game state, because whether a planeswalker has been activated determines whether it is legal to activate. And the active player has made a decision based on this statement not to activate their planeswalker, even though it would be perfectly legal to do so because they haven't activated it. This is a CPV. Similarly, the active player wrongly states that their attacking creature has flying and therefore can only be blocked by other flying creatures or creatures with reach. And therefore, the opponent does not block it. The opponent has made a decision based on the statement this creature has flying. And because that statement was incorrect, this is a CPV. Or the non-active player is at 3 life and says, I'm at 5 life. And as a result, the active player could kill them with a lightning bolt, but thinks that they can't, so they lightning bolt a planeswalker instead. They've made a decision based on that wrong statement. Now, keep in mind, these statements, if made deliberately for the purpose of misleading the opponent, would be cheating. But if they're accidents, if they are unintentionally wrong statements, if the player made a mistake in communicating, then it's still an infraction, but it's not cheating. It's a communication policy violation. I'm also going to show you some examples that are not CPV. So the non-active player blocks an attacker with multiple blocking creatures, and the active player does not announce a damage assignment order. And they're supposed to announce a damage assignment order and say what order those creatures are going to take damage. So this is definitely bad communication, but it is not a CPV because it does not violate the communication policy. Can anyone tell me what type of infraction this is? You can type it in the chat. I'm going to go on. Yes. So a couple of people have said this is a game of violation. It's correct. Not announcing damage assignment order is a game of violation. In fact, there is, as Ron says, a partial fix available. So you don't need to back up the game. You just have the active player announce a damage assignment order. Another example that's not a CPV, the active player attacks, non-active players moving some creatures around, thinking about how they're going to block. And they pause for a moment, and the active player thinks that they're done. So they cast a spell to kill one of the creatures they think is blocking, and then the non-active player says, wait, I'm not done blocking. I haven't decided how I'm going to block. There's definitely bad communication here. The non-active player didn't say anything to clarify what they're doing. The active player made an assumption based on the silence when they could have asked a question to clarify what's going on. The players have communicated very poorly here. But it's not a CPV. Nobody made a wrong statement about free information or status information or derived information. It's just bad communication. And the third example is the active player casts a spell. The non-active player says, okay. And the active player interprets this as meaning that spell resolves. The non-active player actually means I acknowledge that you have cast the spell and I'm thinking about whether I want to counter it. So again, the players have communicated poorly. They're not on the same page. They don't understand. They don't have a common shared understanding of what the meaning of the word okay is, but this is not a CPV. Maybe somebody's made a decision based on this communication, but this communication is not a statement about status information or free information or derived information. In fact, the word okay has no official meaning in Magic. So if there is a CPV, what is the fix? We back up to the time that the player made a decision based on the miscommunication. Now, note, we're not backing up to the time of the miscommunication. If somebody takes an action, makes a statement in their first main phase that is wrong, and then later on, somebody makes the decision based on that erroneous statement, we're not backing up all the way to the first main phase. We're backing up only to the time that the decision was made. The example I have here is that the non-active player makes a bad block during combat because the active player made a false statement earlier in the turn. So you only back up to declare blockers, let the non-active player change the decision that they've made based on the bad communication. Now, backup is not mandatory. There's certainly times you're not going to back up. Like if the false statement happened 3 turns ago, it's probably not going to be feasible to back up the game to a decision that was made 3 turns ago, but you should always strongly consider it because it is restoring equity to the person who made the decision based on the false statement. Any questions about types of information? Let's see, we have a question here. Chris asks, if there's a change of decisions made due to the miscommunication, which point do you back up to? So if there's a bunch of decisions here, you're going to have to do some analysis and figure out which of these decisions were based on the miscommunication. Ideally, you'll back it up to the first decision made based on the miscommunication, but if this happened over a period of time, it might be feasible only to back it up partway. Again, like if somebody made a miscommunication 3 turns ago and the other player has made if someone made a wrong statement 3 turns ago and the other player made a decision 3 turns ago and then another decision 2 turns ago and then another decision last turn, maybe you'll decide you can only back it up to the most recent decision. But you should try to back it up all the way if you can. And QJ asks question about a scenario where the non-active player has a modal double face card, Jawari Disruption / Jawari Ruins, and the land side is face up. I guess the land side is face up in their hand, and they get duress cast on them by their opponent. The non-active player doesn't say anything. Active player could legally take Jawari Disruption, but thinks this card is a land on the front side and thinks it's not a legal choice for duress. This is kind of vague because no one's actually making a statement, but it certainly looks to me like the non-active player is misrepresenting information about the card because they're essentially telling their opponent that this card is a land when it's actually a non-land. I would treat it as a communication policy violation and back it up because there's basically no way for the active player to have the actual information of that card because they're pretty reasonably presuming that their opponent is representing the card correctly. So this is, I think, one of those rare cases where there's no verbal communication, but there is communication going on and is a wrong statement about, in this case, derived information. It's about the oracle text of the card. And I would back that up. Chris asks, do both players have to agree to the point of the backup? Well, no, you're the judge. You're deciding whether to back it up and how far. If the players don't agree on like when the decision was made or something like that, you might have to do some digging to get answers and figure out exactly what happened so you can figure out where the backup should go to. But ultimately, it's not the player's decision, it's the judge's decision. Ron asks about free information, game scores or match scores. Are spectators allowed to access this information? Well, spectators have no right to any of this information. So if there's if there's a wrong statement made to a spectator, that spectator has no recourse because they're not involved in this match. Now, if the opponent hears it and makes a decision, then we could have a problem. So if the spectator comes in partway through the game and thinks, the match score is 1-0 when it's actually 1-1, that really does not matter, as long as both of the players understand what the correct game score is or the correct match score is. That's what's important. Spectator never is entitled to anything here. So let's move on to the next section of the MTR. And again, if anybody has any requests for any of these categories, I'm happy to jump. This presentation will work completely fine no matter what order we do this in. I mean, now that we've talked about types of information, it's not really going to come up again. So let's talk about shortcuts. Shortcuts are covered in section 4.2 of the MTR. And before I get into the definition of shortcuts and some examples of shortcuts, I want to talk more generally about the philosophy behind this section of the MTR. The reason we have shortcuts and the reason we have official shortcuts is that shortcuts reflect how players communicate in real life. Players are not computers. They're not going to do something the exact same way every time. They're going to use slang. They're going to use fewer words because it's less effort to use fewer words. They'll, refer to things in an unofficial way, but all of these are still methods of communication. And we always want communication to be clear to both players, which is ultimately the goal of these policies. Shortcuts help play be smoother, more efficient, more quick. And if you have to say, for example, every single priority pass, it's going to be very laborious and very tedious, and it's not going to be as fun as if you can just say what the important and necessary priority passes are. You don't have to say pass priority in my upkeep step. Are you ready to move to the draw step? Draw my card. Pass priority in my draw step. Are you ready to move to my first main phase? That is just incredibly tedious. And I mean, it was tedious for me, and I spent about 5 seconds doing it. Shortcuts also protect players, especially players who are less experienced with the game, more casual. Maybe they play a tournament every couple of months. Maybe they usually play with their friends only, and they're coming to the store to play in a big tournament. And again, the shortcut policy applies at every rules enforcement level. So, if a player only goes to the store 4 times a year to play in the pre-release, the shortcut policy is for them just as much as it is for the players who go to every Friday Night Magic every week. And we want players' communication to mean what they think it means. And we don't want the opponent to twist their words and say, ha, you said something in a certain way, and therefore, I get to do something that you weren't expecting. We want, when a player says something like, we're going to go to combat, we want that statement to mean what they expect. And we have official meanings for certain shortcuts so that players can maintain shared expectations. So even if these players have never met before, we have this policy that they can fall back on that will give specific meaning to their communication to help them be on the same page and understand each other. Now, this is especially helpful when players don't have the same native language, because if they're playing, if they're using a non-native language to communicate, the shortcuts have a meaning in that language, and they can fall back on that meaning in case they are unaccustomed to communicating in that language normally. So now that we've looked at the philosophy, the reason why we have a shortcut policy, let's look at some examples of specific shortcuts. Now, this list is not exhaustive. There are a lot of official shortcuts, and they would not all fit on this page. And they don't really need to, we don't need to go through every one, because this is not so much to explain the meaning of all the shortcuts as to explain what the general policy is and how to apply this policy about shortcuts. So one of the most common shortcuts is attack or combat or declare attackers or go to combat, anything that means something like I'm about to attack. This shortcut moves the game to the beginning of combat step. And if the opponent is acting, they're going to be acting in the beginning of combat step. One of the interesting things about this shortcut is that it actually requires 2 sets of priority passes to actually move out of the beginning of combat step and into declare attackers. And we'll see some of the aspects of this particular shortcut in a bit. Similarly, go or pass or end my turn or I'm done or you can take your turn, anything similar, moves the game to the end step, and the opposing player is considered to be acting in the end step unless they say otherwise. Another shortcut is a player who puts multiple objects onto the stack is considered to let each one resolve before adding the next one. And this is partially a strategically designed shortcut because this is usually the best way, the best strategy to play. If you have something like Pestilence, which can be activated, Enchantment that can be activated multiple times in one turn, it doesn't need to be tapped. It's usually better to activate it and let it resolve, and then activate it and let it resolve. But players are not going to say, activate Pestilence, does it resolve? Activate Pestilence, does it resolve? They're just going to say, activate Pestilence 6 times. They're going to use that shortcut. And because what they usually want to do is have each one resolve before the next one goes, even if they haven't really thought this through and aren't able to communicate that, haven't thought about communicating that long explanation of what's going on, we have the shortcut here so that this is what it means. It helps them communicate to their opponent, helps their opponent understand what it means. Another shortcut is that if a player prematurely announces a choice, they're held to that choice unless the opponent takes an action to respond. So if somebody casts a meddling mage and names a card, or a pithing needle and names a card, like let's say player says, casts a pithing needle and says, I name Jace the Mind Sculptor. And the opponent says, I don't know why you would do that. I'm not playing blue. Well, the player is held to that premature choice because the opponent has not taken an action to respond. And the last example here is a player who forgets to scry or forgets to surveil is assumed to have done so and left the cards where they were on top of the library and didn't put them at the bottom, didn't put them in the graveyard, but they're still considered to have scried or to have surveilled. Let me see if I get your name right, Bunyakiet, points out if there is a miscommunication or if there's a violation of any of these communication policies, should always investigate to see if this was done on purpose. Because if a player is deliberately trying to deceive the opponent, such as having a card with the back side visible, there's potentially cheating going on. But if you investigate, you decide it's not cheating, it can still be a violation of the communication policy. So how do we apply the shortcut policy? Something that's important to keep in mind that the shortcut policy, unlike the communication policy violation infraction that's in the IPG, the shortcut policy is there for really only there for when players don't agree about the meaning of communication. So if players don't agree and that communication matches an official shortcut as for you, you just apply the meaning. If somebody says, I'm done, and then the other player takes an action and the players don't agree about where in the turn that action is being taken, well, you have an official shortcut for what I'm done means. And it says the opponent is acting in the beginning, acting in the end step. So if the players don't agree, as a judge, you just say, well, we have an official shortcut, and it means you're acting in the end step. The purpose of the shortcut policy is to make the game clear for both players. So what that means is if it's already clear, if the players are already communicating successfully and they both understand each other and they both have the same interpretation of what their communication means, you don't need to do anything, even if it doesn't match the shortcut policy. So if one player says something that matches a shortcut and the other player understands what that means, and they both agree on that meaning, that's fine. That's the important thing. What we want is for players to be communicating clearly. We only need to step in if the players don't agree. So if the player says, I'm done, and the other player takes an action, and both of these players believe this action is being taken in the next upkeep step, great. You should be very happy as a judge. The players are communicating successfully. They both agree on what the communication means. Doesn't matter that this violates an official shortcut. Conversely, if one of the players is uncertain about the meaning of a shortcut or upset about the meaning of their interpretation of a shortcut or what their opponent thinks it means or what they think it means, or if they don't agree, then as a judge, you should step in, even if the players don't call you. If you are aware of this disagreement between them, if you're watching a match and they start arguing with each other, if a spectator comes to get you and says, hey, judge, in the match over there, the player that seems a little unclear about what a shortcut means, you should go ahead and start speaking to the players, clear up their communication, even if they did not call you over. Now, we have an official shortcut policy, but players can also establish unofficial shortcuts. And there's two ways this can be done. They can set up an unofficial shortcut expressly. It can discuss it and say, for example, one player has a prodigal sorcerer and thinks, oh, this is a lot of syllables if I have to say every time I'm tapping my prodigal pyromancer to deal 1 damage to you. And I'm lazy, I don't want to use all these words. Let's just agree that every time I want to do this, I'm going to say ping. Just 1 syllable, really short. I'll say ping. It means I'm tapping my prodigal pyromancer to deal 1 damage to you. Other player says, sure, that's fine. I understand what you mean. So they've set up their own shortcut, applies only to this match, doesn't apply to any other players in the tournament, doesn't apply to any other matches. That's totally legal. And then from that point to the rest of the match, that unofficial shortcut will now have a specific meaning. Ping will always mean I'm tapping my prodigal pyromancer to deal 1 damage to you. It's also possible for players to set up a shortcut implicitly without discussing it, just because of their history of communication. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, the word okay has no official meaning in Magic. But if the players have been playing as though every time one of them says okay, that means the spell resolves, and you're called over to a match, let's say we're 30 minutes into the match, and they don't agree on the meaning of the word okay. Well, before you say to them, okay has no official meaning, you should investigate and look into the history of their communication. Because if they have been communicating up to this point in such a way that okay has become an unofficial shortcut, okay now means that spell resolves because that's the way they've been playing, you should now apply this unofficial shortcut and say, well, look, up to this point, every time one of you has said, okay, you have both agreed, that means the spell resolves. So now if you don't agree what that meaning is to the word okay, you're going to have to use that unofficial shortcut you've set up. Because you have communicated that way up to this point, it's totally reasonable for one of you to expect that to continue to mean the spell resolves. And that's going to be really important whenever you're coming over to a match. If the players have a history of communication, that's something you need to look into because it can definitely change your ruling. Now, there are some exceptions to the official shortcut policy, and I'm going to go over some of these. A lot of these are going to end up being about potentially tricking the opponent, which we don't want to happen. So a player is not allowed to request priority and then not use it. We used to have this illegal, and it worked out very badly sometimes because someone would say to the active player, hey, can I do something in your first main phase? And the active player wants to be friendly and wants to be nice. And they say, sure, you can do something. I don't mind. I can wait for what I have to do until you want to do something. And then the opponent says, well, you know what? I'm just going to pass. And since you passed me and I'm passing back, we're going to advance to the combat step. No, this is 100% not allowed. If you request priority and you don't do anything with it, priority goes back to the person who just had it. So you cannot use this trick. This trick does not work. Another exception to the official shortcut policy is that while one of your spells or abilities is resolving, you cannot assume your opponent is taking a shortcut. You have to seek express confirmation that a choice with no visible impact was taken. So for example, if you cast Path to Exile on your opponent, now your opponent should be searching their library for a basic land. That's one of the things that Path to Exile does. If the opponent doesn't do that and says nothing, you cannot assume that they've chosen not to search for a basic land. You have to ask them and confirm, hey, you're allowed to search for basic land. You don't want to do that? Can you confirm that for me? And the last exception I want to mention is, of course, players can always deviate from shortcuts for themselves, not for their opponent, just for themselves, as long as they're explicit about it. So normally, if someone says pass the turn, the opponent is assumed to be acting in the end step, unless they say otherwise, but they can say, I'm acting at a different point in the turn if they wish. Let's look at some examples of exceptions here. Active player resolves Eager Construct, which has an ability when it enters the battlefield, each person can scry. And they see their opponent does not look at the top card of the library. And then we have a shortcut when a player fails to scry. The official shortcut is, if a player fails to scry, they are considered to have done so and left the card on top. But because this is happening during the resolution of an ability that belongs to the active player is not allowed to assume that their opponent has followed this official shortcut. They're actually obligated to remind their opponent, hey, you can scry one. Makel asks a question. If the player didn't ask, do we step in the Path to Exile case? Yes, so like I said previously, you don't need to step in unless you believe the communication is unclear, but there's definitely a pretty strong potential here that there is unclear communication, that the other player didn't realize they were allowed to search for basic land, for example. Maybe they didn't read Path to Exile, maybe they're not familiar with what the card does, maybe all the other player said was, I cast Path to Exile, and the player didn't look at the card. Because there's such a high potential that the players are not communicating well here, you should step in as a judge. And same thing for the Eager Construct case. If one of the players doesn't scry, you should step in as a judge and remind them, hey, you can scry, because there's a very, very high potential. And if you wait to see if somebody gets upset, it might be, the game might have advanced and it might be too late to effectively step in. Ace asks, is this the same as Riot? If the owner doesn't specify to add a +1/+1 counter, can they be assumed they chose haste, or does it need to be confirmed? Well, so for Riot, the player is making a decision for themselves. So the exception that we're talking about here doesn't apply. Because Riot is not a triggered ability, it is mandatory. It always is going to apply one way or the other. I would assume that as a judge, that if they didn't add a +1/+1 counter, that they chose haste, because it's legal. It's perfectly legal for the creature to enter the battlefield without a +1/+1 counter. I don't think I would treat this as a shortcut issue. I mean, players allowed to say nothing, and if it has haste, it has haste. Ian asks, if they're assumed to have scribed but didn't, can they still look at the top card later on? Well, players are not allowed to look at the top card of the library at any time, unless they have an ability that lets them do so. So if the turn has advanced past the scry, I would not allow them to look at the top card, because if they did scry and leave it on top and they forget what it is, they're not allowed to look at it later. So I would treat it the same way. That particular shortcut is useful mostly so you don't have to back up if somebody forgets to scry or forgets to surveil, because it does become potentially cumbersome and potentially disruptive if you try to back up to a scry or to insert a scry later on. And again, it's resulting in a legal game state because the player is allowed to leave the card on top. So the game state is still legal. Another example about deviating from shortcuts. So here we have a card called Necrologia. which is only legal to be cast during the end step. So let's say the active player has one card in their hand, which is Necrologia, and the active player says, play land, go, I'm done with my turn. The non-active player says, in your second main phase, cast Funeral Charm. That's just an instant speed discard spell. Make you discard the only card in your hand. So the non-active player is deviating from the shortcut here because the shortcut says when one player says go and the other player acts, they're assumed to be acting in the end step. The non-active player has said, I'm not acting in the end step, I'm acting in the second main phase. And because the non-active player has been very explicit about when they're acting and has deviated from the shortcut, this is not a legal time for the active player to cast Necrologia. If the non-active player just said, cast Funeral Charm and said nothing else, then we go back to the shortcut policy, which says the official meaning of this is that they're casting Funeral Charm in the end step. And then in that case, because they did not deviate from the shortcut, the active player can respond by casting Necrologia because it is the end step. Any questions about shortcuts before we move on? Okay, I'm getting pretty short on time, so I'm going to jump to reversing decisions because I have some questions for the audience at the end. Reversing decisions is covered in section 4.8 of the MTR. This is a relatively new policy. And just like shortcuts, well, the purpose of reversing decisions is largely to make communication clear to the opponents. But specifically for reversing decisions, we don't want Magic to be a game of gotcha, where a player makes a mistake and they're committed to that mistake, even if they realize immediately that they made a mistake. You know, if a player plays the forest on their first turn and suddenly realizes, hey, I have counterspell in my hand, I really should play an island so that next turn I can also play an island and then I'll be able to cast counterspell. We don't want them to be stuck with that mistake just because they realized it a little bit too late. And we also don't want to create an incentive for players to be extra slow and extra careful because they're afraid that they'll be stuck with a mistake. If they are worried that every mistake they make, they're locked in, instead of playing at a normal speed, they're going to like pull out a card from the hand, look at it, think for a moment, double check, do I want to play this card? Okay, I can play this card. They're just going to take more time. It's going to make the game slower and less fun for the players. And there's really no benefit to locking them into that mistake. So we have a policy that tells us how and when we can reverse decisions so that if a player makes a mistake and realizes it soon after, they can fix it. That's the general philosophy behind this policy. So what is the definition? When are we allowed or when are we allowing players to change a decision? If a player takes an action and wants to reverse it, wants to make a different action, if the player has not gained any new information since they took the original action, then the judge may permit the player to change the decision. This is the crucial decision for the judge, the crucial test, whether the player has gained new information. If you're not sure as a judge whether they gain new information, you should err on the side of caution and don't allow the player to change the decision. But really, only if you're really genuinely not sure. If you believe the player has not gained new information, you should allow them to change the decision. If the player is playing as part of a team, whether it's two-headed giant or team trios or some similar format, it is allowed for a teammate to step in and prompt a player to change a decision. This is not considered new information if the teammate speaks up, as long as no other information has been gained. And we'll look a bit to see what is considered new information, but information coming from a teammate is not new information. So you're still allowed for your teammate to tell you, hey, don't play that forest, play that island instead. How do we apply this policy? Again, as I said earlier, the key is, has the player gained information? The most common ways of gaining information are drawing cards, because you now have information you didn't have before about what is going to be in your hand, what you'll be able to do in this game. or if the opponent responds or even doesn't respond. Like if the opponent is playing blue and has 2 untapped islands and you cast a spell and they don't do anything, that could be significant information. You know your opponent is not going to counterspell whatever you just cast. So even if the opponent doesn't actually do anything, that can be new information. And of course, if the opponent does do something, that's definitely new information. It is also possible for there to be visible information that the player didn't notice or didn't realize. But if someone else points it out, that can be considered new information. So if a player casts a spell and the opponent says, "Hey, like you realize, I have this untapped forest, or I'm playing green, or like there's this creature card in my graveyard that I could maybe use in response," or something like that. That can be new information, even though all of that was visible to the player. If they just didn't realize it, but somebody else pointed it out, whether it's a spectator, which is usually bad, but still new information, or the opponent, that will prevent the player from changing their decision. And unlike out-of-order sequencing, which unfortunately we haven't really had time to discuss, a substantial pause does not inherently prevent a player from reversing decisions. Now, if there's a substantial pause and the opponent could be responding during this pause and doesn't, that could be new information. But let's say like the opponent is tapped out, they have no cards in their hand, there's literally nothing they can do. The player can cast a spell, think for 10 seconds, and then say, well, actually, I want to target something else, or I want to cast a different spell, or I want to play land before I cast this spell. It's okay for a player to change that decision, even if they have had a little bit of time to think about it. Let's look at some examples. So classic example, player wants to change the land that they played. It happens all the time. Generally, completely okay. Or a player says, declare attackers. No, wait, I want to cast this haste creature in my hand first before declaring attackers so that I can attack with this creature also. That's fine. Again, even if there's a pause, like they say declare attackers, and again, as long as they're not getting any new information, they can say, wait, before I declare attackers, I want to cast this haste creature. Any questions about reversing decisions? So I have some questions for the audience now about what we've discussed. So first, I have a couple of questions about communication policy. These are specifically about about identifying communication policy violations. So here's a scenario, and I'd like you to tell me, is this a CPV or not? Playing at an RCQ, a regional championship qualifier, so this is competitive rules enforcement level. The active player has a 1/1 elf warrior token that casts Elvish Archdruid, which gives all elves +1/+1. The non-active player is at 3 life. They have no cards in their hand. All they have is a 1/1 creature. The active player attacks with a token and says, this is printed as a 1/1. This is a 1/1 token. The non-active player also has a 1/1, so they block, thinking like, maybe they'll trade. The active player says, your creature dies, but mine doesn't, because my creature gets +1/+1 from Elvish Archdruid. Is this a CPV? So what's going on here is that a player has made a statement about derived information, the size of a creature, and again, we're going to assume for Ian's question, you've investigated. You asked the active player, why did you say this? What did you mean? And you've determined the active player was, well, we'll get to what they're doing actually first before we get to the cheating question. But we're going to presume that they've not deliberately violated the communication policy in order to deceive their opponent. So it's not cheating. We've ruled out cheating. That's an important question. You should always investigate if you think there is potentially cheating going on here. But this is actually not an incorrect statement, because this elf warrior is printed as a 1/1. It has 1/1 on the card. So if the active player says this is a 1/1 token, that statement is not misrepresenting derived information. And although the active player has made a decision, 100% made a decision based on the statement, because the statement does not violate the communication policy, it's not a CPV. and there are ways they could say that where it would be a CPV, but like just saying that like this is a 1-1, this is the printed power and toughness is not a misrepresentation. Generally, it can be a bad idea for a player to assume that the opponent is being completely making a thoroughly complete statement about derived information, because players are allowed to omit potentially relevant derived information. Second example, again, this is at a Grand Prix, so it's competitive rules enforcement level. Active player asks the opponent, how many cards do you have? And the non-active player says, I don't have to help you. I'm not going to answer that. Is this a communication policy violation? And of course, this is something you should be thinking about as a judge whenever you see or overhear this communication, or if players call you over, because you're going to have to deal with players who are upset about their opponent's communication, and then you as a judge have to decide, is it a problem? So there's 2 points. Several people have pointed out that no one's made a decision about this, so it can't be CPV. This is also perfectly legal statement. Players are never required to answer a question about derived information. Now, if they choose not to answer the question, they must enable the opponent to get the information for themselves. So if they don't want to answer, they can't hide their cards in their hand. They have to allow the other player to physically count the cards. And if they do try to hide the information, then as a judge, you'll have some questions. But they don't have to answer the question. They can remain silent, or they can refuse to answer the question. As Joel says, your opponents don't have your best interest at heart. They're trying to win the game. So maybe they're not going to make statements that are as helpful to you as you would like. So the next question I have for you is about shortcuts. So here's a sequence of communication. Active player says combat. The non-active player says, okay. Active player says, crew my vehicle and attack. And the non-active player says, hey, judge, is this legal? Siang Lee asks, can the active player check the number of cards? Yes, so if the opponent refuses to answer the question, how many cards do you have? The active player can look at the hand or reach over to the hand and maybe ask the other player to spread them out so I can count them more easily. But yes, they can always visibly check the number of cards. So is this the shortcut question? Is this when the non-active player calls you over and says, hey, judge, is this legal? Because I said sure, I passed priority when my opponent said combat. Are they allowed to crew their vehicle before they attack? We have several answers saying yes, and that is correct. This is legal. And this actually changed back around the time of Kaladesh, because this shortcut used to work a little differently. But the way it works now is it requires 2 sets of priority passes in order to advance to the declare attacker step. So in this sequence, we have 1 set of priority passes. We have the active player offering to move to combat, and the non-active player saying sure. That's 1 set of priority passes. This does not advance the game to the declare attacker step. We're still in the beginning of combat, and in the beginning of combat, the active player can crew their vehicle, and then they can move to the declare attacker step, and attack with their vehicle, which is now a creature. Yes, we blame or credit Smuggler's Copter for the change in this shortcut, which is a good shortcut because it also helps with things like lands that become creatures. And frankly, we should have had, the shortcut should have been designed that way originally. We have a question from Zion Tan. I have no cards in hand. My opponent asks, how many cards do I have? I spread out my fingers, showing my hands are empty, and I say, I have 10 cards in my hand. Have I committed an infraction? I'm afraid you have committed an infraction at competitive, or actually any rules enforcement level, because you made a false statement about derived information, about the number of objects in a zone. Now, sure, yes, you're spreading your hand, but best case scenario probably is the opponent's going to be confused, and they're going to think, well, why are you saying you have 10 cards in your hand when I don't see any cards? It might lead them to do something. Okay, so once they make a decision based on you having 10 cards in your hand, yes, there's an infraction. It's a violation of communication policy, regardless, because it's a false statement about derived information. I have 10 fingers in my hands is okay. That's not a question. That's not a statement about any kind of information. It doesn't affect the game. Tomorrow's my birthday is also okay, regardless of whether or not that's true. But yes, if the opponent makes the decision based on a false statement about derived information or free information or status information, that is an infraction. And again, if the opponent doesn't make a decision, then as a judge, I would still remind the player, hey, you're not allowed to make false statements here. I'm not going to give you a warning, but you can't make false statements. So here's the last scenario we're going to discuss. This is a question about reversing decisions. So this is a standard Grand Prix, again, competitive rules enforcement level. Thank you, Joel. Tomorrow's not my birthday. At a standard Grand Prix, the active player controls 2 creatures, and the opponent is tapped out. They can't do anything. The active player casts Rune of Might on 1 creature, and Rune of Might has an enters the battlefield ability. It says when Rune of Might enters the battlefield, draw a card. So they resolve the enters the battlefield ability, and then they say, you know what? I'm actually going to cast Rune of Might on this other creature because I'd rather attack with this other creature instead of my first creature. So I want the +1/+1 to go to the second creature instead. As a judge, do you think this is okay? Would you allow the player to reverse this decision? So a couple players have pointed out this player has gained new information. They now have an additional card they did not have before, and they know what this card does and how it will affect their strategy. So they are not allowed to reverse the decision. That is the end of my presentation. I've gone a few minutes over time, for which I apologize, but I hope all of you have learned something about the communication policy in the MTR. I definitely would encourage you to go read it, because it's always a good idea to be familiar with these policies before you go judge. And again, these policies all apply at any rules enforcement level. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me on Discord or on Facebook, and I'm happy to answer any other questions you have. So thank you for listening.